It's a Thursday in late July, about 9 in the evening, and I'm swimming in the River Thames on Port Meadow in Oxford. Got the airy cages of Gerard Manley Hopkins poplars behind me, and the light is going down so that everything is gilded. The grass, the stones, the battered boat on the far side of the river. There's this monumental sky above me. There's peach-coloured lowlands and Himalayas of shoveled snow, and I'm drifting in the middle of the river with my feet dangling down in the darker, deeper, colder water. There's Canada geese, there's cows drinking at the water's edge, there's swifts skimming the surface of the water in search of midges. Over Whiteham Woods behind me, I can see a C-15 banking as it makes its final approach into Bryce Norton Air Base. All that tonnage held aloft, a kind of miracle. When I was a kid, I was terrified of deep water. Partly it was the fear of drowning, partly it was the fear of what I might tread on or get eaten by, pike, jellyfish, great white sharks. Partly it was that abyss that goes down and down to the sulfur vents and the transparent crawling things and the bone-crushing pressure and those uncharted continents of Christ alone knows what. Whenever I teach creative writing, I always tell students to be concrete and to be specific. It's about looking, really looking. Because no one ever eats a chocolate bar, no one ever sees a tree. They eat a Cadbury's Boost, which is slightly rippled with a flat underside. Or they see a poplar with its diamond-shaped leaves and great fissures in the bark and burrs bursting out like a giant's kneecaps. Because it's the detail that makes things come alive. The tigers in red weather, the bracelet of bright hair about the bone, a single raindrop sitting unbroken in a floating feather. But there's something else I'm always looking for in writing, and it's the exact opposite. And I never mention it to students because it doesn't come when you call, and there's no point in going looking for it. When I was 5 years old, I fell into the neighbour's pond. I was reaching out to grab their nephew's sailing boat, and a section of the rockery gave way. I remember the cold and the dark and the somewhat unnecessary depth, and this huge circle of sunlight above my head and some intervening goldfish and a hand reaching down. It was a bit like fainting after I had my BCG injection. Watching the skin pop under the needle and smelling the ether on that cotton wool swab, and then being vaguely aware of some adult voices calling my name from that tiny white coin at the well shaft's mouth. Then there's the other fear. 1996 or so, we're driving from Grenoble to Toulouse to catch a night flight home to Heathrow. Pitch black, very little visibility, and a blizzard coming at the windscreen like we're in the Starship Enterprise making the jump to hyperspace. Amazingly, we get to the airport in one piece. Then we have to wait while they de-ice the plane 3 times. And maybe it's displaced fear that just attaches to the nearest object like napalm or Velcro. But by the time I get to that plane, I know with absolute certainty that I'm going to die in a plunging, flaming tube of aluminium surrounded by 200 people screaming and voiding their bowels. I keep the plane aloft all the way home purely by the grip on the armrests. And for the next month, every time I see or hear a plane overhead, I feel angry and shaky and tearful. A couple of years ago, I read Waterlogged by Roger Deakin, which is a joyous record of all his wild swims throughout the UK, from Foy Harbour in Cornwall up to the Corryvreckan whirlpool off Jura. And something in me sang as I read, and I dreamt of a parallel life in which I wasn't scared of the lightless abyss and the transparent crawling things. But I'd only really done it once. Years ago, before we had kids, my girlfriend and I were running down the side of the Helford Estuary in Cornwall very early one New Year's Day morning. Boslow, Durgan, this fairy tale light in morn and glebe. We came to the little rocky beach below Trebar Gardens and found a huge number of people gathered for the annual icicle swim. Whippety guys in their wetsuits and sturdy shop girls in their bikinis, this huge bearded Father Christmas in tiny red Speedos. And there was a brazier on the high water mark, 50 orange holes punched into a dustbin and all the sparks rising like birds in the smoke. It was out round the lifeboat and back, and we thought, what the hell? So we stripped off, the gun went, and we stumbled over the pebbles into the surf and dived. I remember hearing screams coming from behind me, an ice cream headache just there and cold like hammers. I rounded the anchor chain and came back. And when I walked up that beach towards the brazier, I don't think I've ever felt warmer or more noble in my entire life. I guess it was catching myself by surprise. The people, the sense of occasion, the realization that if I didn't do it, I'd have missed something really special. I did 5 fear of flying courses. I thought I'd cracked it, and then I saw a plane take off with an engine fire from Fiumicino in Rome. Actual flames coming out of the port cowling. I thought I might be hallucinating because that's what I expect to see when I go to an airport. But all the flights were delayed for 3 hours, and by the time our flight was called, I had taken 35 milligrams of Valium, which is enough to put a horse to sleep. But I was still having trouble breathing. So the cabin services director ushered me behind one of those little modesty curtains they have and said, yeah, I was right. A blue Panorama Airways plane en route to Havana had been forced to do a rapid handbrake turn, but they'd come down fine, everyone was safe. Nevertheless, I spent the whole flight in the back row, having my hand held by another member of the cabin crew as I wept quietly all the way home. And I avoided air travel for quite some time after that. I run regularly up the Thames, Ancient, King's Lock, Godstow, this growing stillness inside and outside my head. And I guess it was shame that did it in the end, the realization that I was running beside this extraordinary swimming pool and missing something very special indeed every single time. So one day, I caught myself by surprise. I just stopped and I stripped off and I walked in. I do it all year round now. 3 minutes max in the winter to avoid the embarrassment of an ambulance. And something in me sings every single time. And maybe it's those Scandinavian genes, the same ones that call to me when I see pine forests and lakes and capable blonde women in zigzag sweaters. All those little details, the way my hands warp under a bottle green bow wave, grebe chicks riding on their mothers' backs, swimming in the rain, the way the water surface fizzes and pops while I drift in the submarine quiet. A single drop of rain sitting unbroken on a floating feather. A dog ran away with my socks once. It's about being inside the landscape, some kind of membrane breaking down. And I want to say what it's like because I'm a writer and that's what writers do, but I can't. And as time goes on, I begin to realize that that's the important thing, being in a place where the words no longer work. Course number 6 didn't do much good either, so I upped my game and I paid for Carol from Aviatours to join me on a flight to Manchester and back. I rather fell in love with Carol, mostly because of her sheer joy at being in the air. Carol, however, was in love with Concorde, on which she'd worked as a stewardess for 8 years. She talked about it as a glamorous ex-lover, and before she got too old, she was going to travel the world and say goodbye to all 19 of them in New York, Toronto, Le Bourget, Chantilly, Virginia. As we taxied to the runway, I looked out the window, and something struck me for the first time, that airports are all designed by 7-year-old boys. Huge capital letters on the tarmac, radar dishes, big tires, low-slung cabs, huge fire engines, and actual flying machines. 45 minutes later, we were beginning our descent to Manchester. I looked out the window again, and it struck me that we were on the Millennium Falcon, coming down into Cloud City, or as near as damn it, but without a welcome from the duplicitous Lando Calrissian and Carol ending up locked in carbonite. We could fly. How amazing was it? And how did we forget? And it occurred to me that maybe it would be easier to become a person like Carol who loved being in the air, as opposed to sitting in seat 24C, deep breathing and pretending to still be on the ground. Looking down, I can see Bossom's boatyard and the cows and the poplars. I'm in a Piper Cherokee out of Kidlington Airport, just north of Oxford. It's my first flying lesson. I'm feeling quite nauseous and I've got some really severe abdominal tension. But I'm getting the Millennium Falcon thing again, the way the landscape suddenly turns into its own map, the sheer volume of the sky. John, my instructor, explains to me how, even at this altitude, you can feel the colour of the ground because of the different way in which earth and wheat and water absorb and re-emit heat. And sure enough, 2,000 feet down, there's a reservoir, and I feel us bump on one side and bump off the other. Every year, the Thames floods and creates this enormous temporary lake all over Port Meadow. Every few years, it freezes, and for a week, it's just pure Bruegel. Old ladies dig rusty skates out of their basement. Little girls in tan tights and quilted pink coats turn pirouettes. Dogs pull sleds. Actual ice hockey games with pads, helmets, goals, sideline barbecues. We were walking to school one morning across Port Meadow, thick fog everywhere, thinking that we were the only people in 100 acres of frozen nothing. And then we heard them, somewhere distant and far out, just the faint whoosh and tock of blades and puck. I think the job of a perfect poem is to restore the silence. This tiny, frail, rainbow thing, like a soap bubble, that for a few moments reflects the whole world and then it's gone. That little nothing afterwards, like the sound of one hand clapping. Roger Deakin talks about a kingfisher streaking by in an afterburn of blue. And when I picture the bird, I'm on the lower reaches of the Charwell, where the trees lean over and hug this tunnel of green and quiet. And it's the kingfisher, of course, but it's what's behind and around the kingfisher, the thing that makes the kingfisher possible, the thing that makes everything possible, that thing you sense for just one heartbeat after the kingfisher has gone. And I think the function of the tigers in red weather and the bracelet of bright hair about the bone and the raindrop that sits unbroken on a floating feather is to take us by the hand and lead us at ever greater and greater speeds until we reach the very edge of language and then lets us go. So we spin out into that great frozen nothing where the words no longer work. Kidlington again. 65 miles an hour, and I can feel the Piper Cherokee wanting to be airborne. John pulls back on the yoke, and we rock, and we start our slow climb up to the inversion. 90 minutes of flying I've done now, so I'm a bit of an old hand. John sets the trim, and I take the controls. It is the most beautiful day. We're flying through this archipelago of cumuli. Islands, towers, arches of white, Mediterranean blue right to the horizon. I look down and I can see the gloriously ugly cement works at Bunkers Hill. I can see the golf ball radar globes at Upper Hayford Air Base. I can see the moat of Broughton Castle where I swam last year. But up here, this other world entirely, so hard to judge the scale of anything. Mountains you could scoop up in the palm of your hand. John suggests that I try some banking, see if I can get her over to 20 degrees. So gingerly, I twist the yoke, and the planet swings under us like a big green pendulum. I ask him what we're aiming for, and he points and he says, "That cloud, let's go through that cloud." So gently, I level her up again, and the cloud looms and looms and looms, and we vanish into the white.